Okay, welcome back to the Biology of Kundalini with Jana Dixon. Today we are on page 39, exploring the symptoms still. So this is part 10. If you've missed any of the previous videos, we're going through the book just chunk at a time. So I encourage you to go back and catch up. And here we go. We're going to begin. The unconscious nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, which yogis do have some control over. Many of the Kundalini symptoms arise from the brainstem, which consists of the medulla pons, the cerebellum, and the midbrain. That is the majority of the Kundalini systems originate from areas of the brain that are beyond our normal control. Okay, so normally we're not utilizing these areas of the brain. She's saying during Kundalini we access them. So hence, many of the symptoms and feelings arise directly from physiological events triggered by specific neurocircuits and changes in neurochemistry. But so she's saying specifically because different parts of the brain are turning on by this life force energy coming and flooding the brain where we don't normally use it. A lot of the symptoms are because of that. They're just different experiences than are normal every day. So over the period of peak awakening, sex hormones and other neurochemistry, other pituitary hormones, sex hormones and other pituitary hormones are raging. The heart is radically expanded and engorged with blood. So that's what a lot of heart pressure can feel like. And the digestive system is venting due to parasympathetic hypertonality. Okay, so that means it's being hypertoned, this parasympathetic. That's the relaxing part of your nervous system. It's being toned, so it's allowing the digestive system to kind of relax and vent. That can make you feel gassy or weird in your stomach, like nauseous feelings. Skeletal muscles are ready for action, and hypervigilance is up due to the fight or flight activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So we're stimulating both of them, and they're both acting a little bit stronger than normal. Thus, during a Kundalini awakening, there is simultaneous hyperactivity of 4F response. She calls the fuck, freeze, fight or flight. So that it's not all tongue-in-cheek when I say this 4F response theory. She says it's intimately related to Kundalini symptoms and health consequences. So you're getting like hyperactivity of sympathetic, which is like what's going on, and this parasympathetic, some relaxation going on. You're getting this dual thing. She says, in response to threat, the organism can fight, flee, or freeze. These responses exist as part of a unified defense system. Oh, she's quoting Peter Levine here in Anne Frederick in Waking the Tiger. In response to threat, the organism can fight, flee, or freeze. These responses exist as part of a unified defense system. When fight and flight responses are thwarted, the organism instinctively constricts as it moves toward its last option, the freeze response. As it constricts, the energy that would have been discharged by executing the fight or flight strategies is amplified and bound up in the nervous system. If the organism is able to discharge the energy by fleeing or defending itself, then thus resolving the threat, trauma will not occur. In humans, trauma occurs as a result of the initiation of the instinctual cycle that is not allowed to finish. So when that freeze happens, instead of fighting or fleeing, the freeze is what creates the trauma because the nervous system doesn't have the chance to work itself all the way out, right? It doesn't have the chance to play out the running or the fighting, and that would discharge this energy in the nervous system, but when it can't and it's stopped, it stays in our body, and that is actually what we call trauma. That's what she's saying. When neocortex overrides the instinctual responses that would initiate the completion of this cycle, we will be traumatized. Okay, so that part of our brain, when it overrides then we get traumatized, and that's making us freeze, making us do nothing. The fact that the freeze response occurs during the hypertonality of both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems has profound implications. She says, I used to think the paralysis that occurs during extreme events was due to overloading of the sensory motor cortex with Kundalini energy. This may play a part, but now I think the paralysis is due to the brainstem stimulating an extreme parasympathetic response to meet the extreme sympathetic activity that's occurring. Thus, both on and off switches are on full bore. Does that make sense? To prevent any further escalation of this duel between the on and off systems of the body, turns into a massive freeze response of the dorsal vagal complex. So the whole dorsal vagal complex is frozen. It freezes. The dorsal vagal complex is a cluster of connected neurons in the brainstem medulla that slows down the energy expending processes. It is the primitive, unmyelinated vagus related to the conservation of metabolic resources. This freeze response is experienced as paralysis. As far as I know, the paralysis only happens during the interconjunction event when the energy is pouring at maximum voltage up the spine. So only when you're getting a massive, she calls interconjunction, this shooting of Kundalini, does the nervous system respond in this way. And she says you have a paralysis or a freeze, like you feel like you can't do anything because both of the nervous systems are at full bore. Thus, the total paralysis instigated by the parasympathetic dorsal vagal freeze complex only occurs with the radical simultaneous activation of the on switch, either in a freeze response or an interconjunction. One of the reasons why paralysis occurred during the full flux up the spine is that the spine must be straight at this time. She says people always talk about their spine becoming rigid as a stick during their spinal interconjunction, and I had that also. This might be similar to sleep paralysis that prevents the body from moving during REM, and also to the state of immobilization without fear that occurs during sexual activity in the female mammal. Yeah, sometimes there's freezing in the sex response because that's just like the best place to go into relaxation. And then also, like she said, in our sleep, so we're not thrashing all around, but it's like an instinctual response when there's that much energy going up the spine to protect the body. You wouldn't want to whip yourself around when you're having that. And a lot of deep meditation can invoke that feeling, and that's why also. During the peak heart expansion event, which she calls heart nova or solar heart, again, the sympathetic and parasympathetic are dueling at their maximum. And the dorsal vagal complex again kicks in and brings on a freeze response. But in this particular situation, instead of paralysis, a dive reflex occurs, okay? She's talking about heart expansion, peak heart expansion. Paralysis, also called a dive reflex, she says essentially pulling the individual into the ground and making them lie flat. A friend of mine was going through this in her own Kundalini experience recently, where she literally felt like her gravity had increased and she couldn't do anything but lay on the ground. It was like pulling her to the ground. That's what she calls the dive reflex. She says the heart that is already laboring at maximum due to expansion doesn't have the work to pump against gravity to get the blood around. So in other words, the body is like, dude, you gotta lay down. You just have to lay down, and there's nothing else you can do but lay down. The body is pulled to the ground during a heart expansion, maybe due to the dive reflex, stimulated by the dorsal vagal complex during a freeze response. The dive reflex or vagal complex governs the dive reflex in reptiles, where they might remain submerged for long periods of time while they're escaping predators or they're pursuing prey, right? Like just the alligator just laying underwater, just peeking, not moving, the cheetah in the bush, or the deer that's totally still hiding, whatever it is, their dorsal vagal complex is what's helping them freeze, is what she's saying. So we have that. So she continues, perhaps both the heart expansion and the dive reflex will always go together as the body tries to tone down the expansion of the heart and dilate vessels. For hyperexpanded heart may stimulate the vagus to initiate a dive reflex to prevent the organism from overexertion when the cardiovascular system is so engorged, dialing and overworking. By lying down, the heart does not have to work so hard. Since the blood vessels and the heart itself are hyperdilated, blood pressure would fall. So lying down would both reduce the toll of low blood pressure and the work of having to push against gravity. Low blood pressure reduces oxygen in the brain, which would make a faint happen. So with acute fatigue, you just want to lie down, is what she's saying. With heart expansions, and I often just lay in my bed. I sometimes fall to the floor, but yeah, sometimes it's just so much that you just even want to lay and like spread your arms wide apart. Have you ever felt like you just gotta lay on the ground and just spread your arms apart and just, like that? She's saying that's the feeling of heart expansion, and I concur. The heart expansions themselves might occur when the parasympathetic gains dominance in the cascade of human activity or Kundalini activity. So you're now getting the relaxation response. They occur during periods of intense bliss, right brain consciousness, and are associated with intense grounding and extreme lethargy. This dive reflex makes more sense than my first explanation, which was the extra grounding needed by the heart field pulling one into the ground during massive heart expansion. Whatever the cause, she's saying it could be that the parasympathetic gets over dominant, or her previous idea, which I liked. Whatever the cause, it must be noted that extreme pull of the body is relieved by lying for half an hour on the grass or bare earth with one's spine on the ground. There's no doubt a key to understanding this phenomenon. By looking into ancient spiritual literature, Hal Puthoff surmised that the spiritual phenomena like levitation of the human body may be due to the ability to mentally cohere the vacuum fluctuation energy. Interesting. This led him to propose the idea that gravity itself must be a redistribution of vacuum fluctuation energy. And she gives a reference. See Hal Puthoff and Alan Steinfeld talks on YouTube. To mentally cohere the vacuum fluctuation would require a quantum phase lock at a certain frequency that would redistribute zero-point energy, warp space-time, and essentially create an anti-gravity field effect like the warp field around a spaceship. So she's saying you'd have to be able to mentally put yourself into that quantum phase lock. As far as for levitation, like you'd have to phase lock at a specific frequency and like redistribute the 0-point field like around you so that you could pop like a quantum particle is what I'm getting. If biological systems can do this, it would probably be due to their liquid crystal structure and the monatomic M-state elements in their nervous system. And then she's like, I have no idea what I'm talking about, but it sounds like fun. For extreme symptom demands wild speculation. Well, I mean, M-state elements in the nervous system, monatomic elements, this would be from consuming monatomic elements. I mean, we are meant to have them in all of our muscles and nervous system, but most humans are depleted in them. I'm just going to grab something that, it's like Ormus. So she's saying this is one brand of Ormus, Ethereum Gold. And that's the M state, the monatomic elements. So I guess I'm just going to eat some since she talked about it. they call this consciousness elements. So they are like 0 point. And they help your consciousness attain 0 point, where healing occurs from. And that's where inspiration comes. I'm not loving my hair at this moment. Excuse me. Okay, so she brought in the 0 point, so I thought that was cool. She's saying the ability to do this in humans, to levitate, or I'm guessing to do other things like bilocate, it would be due to the monatomic elements in the nervous system allowing you to phase lock at a 0 point. Sounds like a fun thing to think about. Other Kundalini symptoms such as inner conjunctions, bio-lightning, increased psi, and the desire for grounding, the great desire for grounding in open air. In fact, all Kundalini phenomena might be somehow linked to the increased biological interaction with 0 point energy. I mean, if you think about it, where's all my organites? Organite creates an orgone field, which is a 0 point energy field. It is also the word orgone, William Reich called, because it was the orgasmic energy of the universe, which is the life force, which is the Kundalini, which is the 0 point. So of course it makes sense that you are increasing your orgone field, your orgasmic life force field, when Kundalini is rising. So you yourself, especially at peak, become like a walking organite, like you become like a walking 0 point healing field of inspiration. So our biology starts to hit into 0 point, which is why some magical phenomena or weird or strange things can happen. Scientific investigation of this would propel us directly into the mind of God and the discovery of how ourselves and the universe are put together. The gravity warping sensations could be a fluxing in the nerve sheath between sympathetic and parasympathetic dominance. Since they are both in a highly activated state, this shifting might be more noticeable than usual and give the sensation of gravity crushing or gravity expanding. She says gravity crushing would be the sympathetic, and then the gravity expanding would be the parasympathetic. So you're getting like this fluctuation back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. As nitric oxide increased vasodilation, this would give an expanding gravity effect, while in turn towards vasoconstriction would give the sense of gravity crushing or implosion. It is apparent that when both sides of the nervous system are radically hyperactivated, then the freeze response automatically comes on to modulate the overactivity, essentially to protect the brain so that you're not like, ah, and not only not just freaking out, but that freaking out could cause damage by excess nitric oxide, glutamate, adrenaline, norepinephrine, and cortisol. So these 5 things, if it's going too fast and your brain is like, ah, then that's also bad for you. That's what she's saying, because now you've got too much of those hormones in your brain, and that can cause some problems. I mean, cortisol alone, flushing to the body too often, causes an autoimmune response or a sensation of hives or itching or like attack inflammation sort of things, because your cortisol is saturating everything and the body is having to like try to fix it as fast as it can, but it can't tell where the pain is anymore because that cortisol is just everywhere, or that adrenaline is everywhere, and it's like the body has to do something to cut that. So the freeze response happens. Thus, there must be a freeze in effect throughout Kundalini awakening to varying degrees, culminating in total paralysis during inner conjunction. So at a peak moment, you just can't move. You're just in an oh my God moment. Really, and like not even the hint of taking that in vain, like an oh my God moment. Kundalini is a God moment. By whatever way you want to define that, the big everything, the big love, the big energy. So given the right circumstances, stress could trigger a full-on Kundalini awakening. It appears that the awakening of Kundalini means the prolonged hyperactivation and dance between both sides of the nervous system with periodic dominance of the freeze response during extreme inner events. It could be that after a certain period of this extreme nerve activity, the immune system goes into a radical catabolic condition, which she calls the die-off. Part of the function of die-off could be the resetting of the nervous system equilibrium, breakdown of axioms, and restructuring to a more mature or advanced functioning. So the nervous system is getting this blast, and then you're like, ah! And then you're like freeze, and then you crash, this die-off. The body has to go, oh, we don't have enough encasing right now, and the old stuff we were using, that's not gonna work. So before another bolt of cosmic lightning comes through here, or like an increase of voltage of the nervous system from this Kundalini energy, this organ, this life force, this consciousness increases in this person again, we have to clean house, is basically what he's saying, or she's saying. We have to reset the nervous system. We have to restructure it into an advanced function. So it does seem that the sense and being overwrought and out of our depths disappears after a die-off, because now we've assimilated or we've integrated our metamorphic progress to date. And now we have a new lease on life. So this is a great template for understanding change in general, because Kundalini awakenings do follow the basic pattern of transformation and change, which is you're going to get these weird symptoms. You're going to see that there is something going on, something is changing, and you can feel it, and then you will get this burst of energy, inspiration, consciousness, awareness, life force that gives you a bigger picture of where you have been. It blows you open, so to speak. And then it freezes you and kind of contracts and recognizes what structures you do not have running. That in order to actually hold that vision or picture longer, you're going to need some new utilities. You're going to need, we had to just test for a minute and see what was going on. And then now you get to integrate. So there's the die-off, there's the crash, the freeze, okay? So that now this integration can occur. And catch up with the metamorphosis, right? The timing of the die-off must correspond to both the intensity and the duration of nerve activity. So there's actually, she's saying, there's a correspondence. There's a correct ratio. It has to correspond. It has to be make sense. That as much of a nervous system output you have, there's an equivalent amount of time it takes to integrate that. And when I do sessions, I would notice that an intense awareness had in the session, or a big healing moment, would used to take a week or 2 weeks to integrate. And over time, remember earlier in the talks, we talked about the spiral of Terence McKenna was talking about. It's actually getting us to 0 point or 100% novelty, so novel moments, right? And they get closer together on the Fibonacci spiral or sequence. And so she's saying the amount of time we're in the aha expansion burst, there's a correlation between the contraction time and the integration of that time as we're hitting into 0 point. So let's see what else she says about that. A more acute phase of neurological chemistry is followed more quickly by a die-off to help bring the organism to rest with the refinement or growth that she or he has occurred in the nervous system. I don't know why I said she or he, it says has. That has occurred in the nervous system. So if it's more acute, then you're going to have a quicker die-off because you're going to need to integrate in the nervous system. Sleep paralysis with its complete or partial atonia most likely is the result of hyper-parasympathetic activation of the dorsal vagal complex. Sleep paralysis is experienced when the individual bypasses directly to REM dream states with its beta wave cortical activity. The REM sleep phenomena is associated with the inhibition of certain motor neurons, inhibitions of sensory input, rapid eye movement, activation of brainstem neurons that control the movement of facial muscles, and important to the hallucinatory experience of dreaming associated with sleep paralysis, and activation of visual pathways. These events normally occur when neurons in the pons medulla structure, medular structure, becomes active after a period of non-REM sleep, okay? So she's just laying a groundwork for sleep paralysis now. Sleep paralysis is an evolutionarily old function to keep animals still while they're sleeping, to prevent them from falling off cliffs, trees, or attracting predators. Seems smart. Certainly it must have emerged simultaneous with REM dream states to prevent motor response to dream imagery. Although you do see the cartoons where they're having the dream, the dog's legs are moving. Normally we're frozen during dreams, so we don't do that. The most obvious neurotransmitter agents to sleep paralysis would be inhibitors GABA, GABA, and glycine. But it's probably more complex than that. Those that become aware of being paralyzed descend to the theta of a hypnagogic states, without going through the normal phases that kick in the loss of consciousness. So they are conscious while paralyzed, usually with amazing visions to account after their journey. The lucid perception of sleep paralysis can give one the sensation of compression on the chest and suffocation of energy as energy is removed from the diaphragm. It is the sympathetic side of the nervous system that stimulates breathing and raises blood oxygen. Okay. Besides Robert Scare's idea of the dorsal vagus complex causing freeze paralysis, another possible cause of paralysis during extreme spiritual energy states could be the hyperactivation of the limbic system and brainstem and its consequent effects on incapacitating the motor sensory cortex. Rod Johnson at brain-mind.com says that freezing is brought about by both the overwhelm of the motor and frontal lobes and the consequent burnout of dopamine and serotonin in these areas, because you're going to get pumped full of those in the bliss states. Freezing is a life-preserving reaction in nature that is apparently mediated by the amygdala and striatum. He writes, the amygdala, under conditions of extreme fear and arousal, can induce catatonic-like frozen panic states, resulting in an inability to initiate a voluntary movement, and the will to move or vocalize may be completely negated. Given the extensive interconnections of the medial frontal lobes, corpus and limbic striatum with amygdala, it appears that when exceedingly aroused or emotionally stressed, the amygdala is able to inhibit, by overactivation, the frontal striatal motor centers. Yeah. So the brain can, make it happen. When this occurs, the organism may fall and cease to move, blink, or even breathe, thus appear to be dead, as in a state of rigor mortis. So this is just your brain. If you're in the circumstance where that needed to occur in order to save you, you would go completely people in extreme fear can completely become paralyzed and faint, or be paralyzed as if like a corpse, right? Raul Joseph suggests the numbing during the fear response is caused by a massive secretion of opiates within the amygdala and base ganglia, while the rigidity and loss of will is a consequence hyperamygdala function or hyperamygdala influence on the medial frontal lobe and corpus and limbic striatum. The amygdala is able to induce these catatonic states via interconnections with the basal ganglia, brainstem, as well as the medial frontal lobes. Under extremely stressful conditions, the striatal, frontal lobe, and amygdala are simultaneously undergoing dopamine depletion. Okay, so think of that. There's stress, they get dopamine, but they're also losing dopamine, which in turn results in hyperactivation of these areas, like more and more, like someone who needs more coffee. In the Eastern traditions, there's a catatonic death-like stare called Naroda, meaning prior to the arising of ignorance and the volition impulse. A deep, like samadhi state. Naroda is a very high, non-meditative, meditative state. During Naroda, there is no time sense. Heartbeat and metabolism are slow and practically cease, so very little energy is burned. I love that Indians have a name for it, Naroda. And body temperature drops well below normal. In fact, this spiritual catatonia is so death-like that there is the danger of being mistaken as dead, and so buried alive. It's said that Naroda is a precursor to the ego death. So this is why it is important, and it has always been important, to have a spiritual guide on your journey who know things like this, because there are some times when the traditional systems are unaware that this particular condition is a spiritual experience, and what a spiritual experience looks like, and what's the biology of it, how does it act. Well, yeah, it might look like such and such a dis-ease that you have written in your journal, your medical journal, or those same corresponding symptoms are also attributed to, and why I want to share and read this with you, because this is an important awareness to bring into our world and culture and society, and a remembering through that through the ages that it has been known, that the body has spiritual growth, not just physical growth, spiritual growth, development of the spirit, right along with your body, but it's just in the unseen parts of us, maturation of the spirit, and that there actually is biological processes going on underneath that. So if Uncle Joe or whatever has been meditating a long time and he's getting old, but he suddenly just falls over into like a Kundalini paralysis, this is saying, just make sure you don't go bury Uncle Joe before realizing that he might just be in Naroda, this samadhi that's just happened. He's going through an ego death, like he'll wake up and you'll think he's just come back to life, but he won't be the same one because he's experienced a shedding. Negredo in Western alchemy is the death-like withdrawal of soul from the body. Interesting. Negredo, and then they call it Naroda. Tingles are felt especially on the left side of the body from the base of the foot up, and bubbles like champagne in the pelvis. Tingles and bubbles are always associated with increased Kundalini flow, heat, and bliss. So the phenomena is probably an effect of the nervous system and opiate receptors. There is some indication that the tingly feeling of Kundalini may be associated with an increased amount of nitric oxide generated by nitric oxide synthesizing nerves. The tingling feeling is interesting. It can feel like you are, when your foot falls asleep or your arm falls asleep, and then that moment before the pins and needles where it just feels weird, but it's just starting to come back, that sort of sensation a lot during some of that nerve activation. Okay, we're up to 35 minutes. How much more do we want to go? This is a little bit longer, so let's do just a little bit more. The left brain freeze was one of the first radical symptoms to arise at the beginning of her July 2000 awakening. This symptom included a pressure clamp and numbness covering the left side of the scalp, extending down the forehead and into the eye socket. This numbness started peaking 3 days before I met my initiator, so my body soul already knew exactly when the meeting was to happen. So again, the backwards ripples, so she's sensing it in her body even before it happens. The alchemy was occurring despite the temporal and geographical distance between us, and my condition proceeded in direct response to when we would meet and be in each other's presence through my conscious mind, though my conscious mind had no idea we would meet at all. For me, the left brain freeze continued in varying intensity through the 3 years that Kundalini was highly active, though it was more severe during the 6-month apex. Now remember, these numbers are flexible. They aren't like set for everyone. Time has been compressing also as we continue along. So what was a longer period of time for, say, me 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago during some of my Kundalini awakenings, and then it took some years to integrate. Now activations will happen, and then the integration is a day. So I would go years sometimes to integrate, and where people are now going a day. And so when she was writing and experiencing this, she was looking at the 6-month period of peak time, but that might not be the case so much anymore. And this is 2008. So we're going to stop right there, I think, today, and just realize that, of course, we're getting this information as soon as we're able to assimilate it. So when you're watching this and you're listening to this, then you are ready to understand this fully. And that's probably because you're going to have to recognize this either in yourself or someone around you, or it's already going on and now you just need to know the ins and outs. We are the new spiritual doctors, those who become aware of life force and how to utilize it. This is very important in the coming time. So I welcome you back. Remember, you can always go on lulu.com and read The Biology of Kundalini by Jana Dixon. On there, she offers it free, or you can go purchase a copy. It's a yummy, big, thick one. We're going through it piece by piece at a time right here so we can honor this spiritual awakening that we're in. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining.